we had talked about the fact that Paul opened up with what had been reported to him and dealt with some of those situations present. And then the next part of it, dealing with questions that were asked by them. Each of these starting with the word now, you'll see repeatedly. In the American Standard especially, you'll notice that in every single case as it goes through these different ones. We're in this chapter 7, verses 1 through 40, dealing with things about marriage and about those who are unmarried, about what to do in the present distress. When we looked last time, we looked for the first 16 verses all the way through regarding the things he said to the married, that they were not to depart from the spouse. If they did, they remained unmarried or were reconciled. If that unbelieving spouse was ready to stay with them, they stayed with them. It was not something where they needed to leave an unbeliever. But if that unbeliever departed, there was nothing they could do about that. They weren't under the kind of a bondage to follow them all the way along as if they were trying to convert them if they wouldn't even listen. So the idea is if they're going to depart, let them depart there. Now we're ready to start with this next part on principles governing Paul's instruction about the married, and then going on to those who are virgins. In verse 17 beginning, as the Lord had called each one in that state, let them remain. And that point is made. Let me notice with you in this first part of it how much that is emphasized. Verse 17, but as God has distributed it to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. Verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Meaning what? If you're married, stay married. If you're unmarried, stay unmarried there. That's the idea that he is giving, and it's going to have a special reason for it a little bit later as he talks about the present distress. But he talked about when you're one who was called in circumcision. Well, you can't become uncircumcised, but for the sake of the statement here, Paul's exaggeration, don't be uncircumcised. If you're called as one who's uncircumcised, don't be circumcised. Why? Use the place that you have to serve God. In either of those places, you can be one who's useful in trying to reach those that are around you. Keep the commandments of God is the point, not the circumcision. It doesn't matter whether you're circumcised or not circumcised. That's nothing anymore. Why? Could that be said back in the time of, say, the prophets? Why not? All right, it was a commandment. Could it be said in the time that was just immediately after Abraham? No, because it was the covenant first given to Abraham. What did it go with? Circumcision went with the seed promise. When you look at Genesis chapter 17, that's the point that's made very clearly. That through thy seed all nations of the earth would be blessed. That cutting of the foreskin, that in proximity of the seed then gave that promise. It was showing that we are living by that promise, looking forward to that seed that is to come, which was Christ. So after Christ came, was there any reason for keeping circumcision? No, because the seed had come. And therefore, that's the fulfillment of it. And there would be no reason for that now. He talks about the example then next of a slave. Were you called being a slave? Don't seek to be free. Are you called being free? Don't try to be a slave. Why? Why would he say to somebody, if you're a slave, you have an opportunity to be free, don't seek that. Use your slavery rather. That seems like an odd thing to say to us. Why would he say that? Go ahead.
Well, both of those situations, acceptable. I guess he's trying to give them the idea that becoming a Christian is perhaps new to them, but it doesn't require them to make this type of change in their life. They can be slave or free, circumcised or not, whatever the case may be, they can still be Christians in that position.
As a slave, what unique opportunity would you have the right or have the ability to take part of in carrying the gospel to people? All right, fellow slaves, because they would be ones more likely to listen to you than they would a free man, wouldn't they? How about that master? If he saw abundant change in you, here you were as one who was not a Christian. You were not the kind of person who was helpful in the business pursuits he had. All of a sudden now, you're a Christian and you're agreeable. You're doing your work the way you should. In fact, exemplary in that. What might he do? Come to you and ask you, hey, what's changed? Why was it you were this way and now you're this way? And you have an opportunity to talk to him about the gospel. Those kind of points, we're in a place wherever we are that we can be used in the Lord's service. Paul says use it rather. That's the idea. Take whatever your place is. Let that be used in a way of service to the gospel of Christ. Same way with regard to a man who's free. He's got others that he can talk to, those who are his fellow people. Maybe he's able to go and in a business, he's traveling, whatever else, as a free man, and therefore he has opportunities to talk to them about the gospel of Christ. The focus then is not on my life and what my socioeconomic status is. It's on what can I do for the Lord. If that's the first, if we're seeking first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, then we're going to use that place in order to serve the Lord. Anything else there? All right? That demands this kind of a principle that's there in the Apostle Paul's life that he's looking at. Now, instruction to those who are single. I'd rather have that read. I forgot to change it today. But regard to those who are unmarried, because that's the term that is used. I'm going to suggest something to you. Who has the New American Standard Version that you're reading out of tonight? Okay, I'm going to call on you in a little bit. How about the NIV? New International Version. Anybody have that? Well, I'm glad, but I want to notice something with you. Generally, New American Standard Version, I've said, is probably the best translation I know of the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, it has some really bad weaknesses. And this is one of them in the latter part of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He starts off with that and pointing out that he's talking to those who are virgins. In verse 25, now concerning what? Virgins. All right. Now, a virgin is one who not only is unmarried, but never married, right? The word virgins in the Greek could only be a feminine noun. There was no such thing as someone being a virgin and having a male ending on that to make it change in gender. That was unheard of. To say that, you had to go about an awkward saying, like it was done over in the book of Revelation, of those who were male virgins. And it was never something that you saw used in the Greek, the Koine Greek of the time. It was done there to make an emphasis of the purity of these ones in the book of Revelation, but certainly not a normal statement in Greek. Now concerning virgins, verse 25, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. All right, so he's going to speak something that's not a commandment of the Lord, meaning what? This is not a law. It's not obligatory. But he says, I'm going to give you my judgment. Does that mean it's a judgment that may be right, may be wrong, either way? It's just about the same thing, coin toss? No. He says, I'm going to give you my judgment. However, a judgment is one whom the Lord has in his mercy made trustworthy. In other words, you need to see the fact that I have been given this responsibility by Christ. I'm putting these things together. I'm putting this instruction together based on all that is given of the Lord. And so there's a judgment that is a judgment of some wisdom that needs to be looked at. In the first two verses, the reason for that judgment has to do with what he talks about in verse 26. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of what? The present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. And so this point that's being made in this present distress, what would that mean? Just take that term, present distress. Okay. Current situation, which has to be of what kind of nature? Okay, there's trouble, there's difficulty that's pointed out. Most likely, if you look at this, I think you're dealing with something where there is trouble that is coming in the Roman kingdom. During this particular time, you have some difficulties that are arising. Nero, in his reign, was the first to really try and clamp down on Christians, especially, and killing them to try to divert attention from his own failures. And then there were several who were after that, Domitian ultimately being the one toward the close of the first century that brought persecution that was unprecedented, unparalleled upon Christians. And so you're going to go through this time when there's going to be difficult times on Christians coming, persecutions that are taking place, and it's going to be mounting as it goes. Now, think of that kind of a situation through the rest of this chapter. Because what he's just introduced is something that is going to be dealt with through the rest of this particular chapter. In verse 27, the statement is made, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. Now, look at that statement. Are you bound to a wife? What would that mean? All right. You've got a bond, that there's a bond there of God that takes place. That you're in that condition where the two of you are bound in marriage. Then the next statement, do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? When you use that word loosed, what does that tend to cause? Go ahead, Jason.
Well, it seems that if at first glance it seems like there's been an action to be loosed from something, but it's not, in my understanding, it's just without wife.
Correct. What are we talking about again? Virgins, right? Now, concerning virgins, it says in 25, does it make sense when he says, I'm talking about virgins, to turn around 2 verses later and say, now somebody who has not been a virgin but been married and has just put away his wife and got out there and had a divorce, you're free to marry. That doesn't fit with the context of this. Nevin, what does the New American Standard put there? Read verse 27 and 28.
Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned. If a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you.
Okay. What does the word released mean? Of necessity. You can't be released unless you were previously bound, right? So that translation from the New American Standard is not the case. The word is just luo. It's if you ever take Greek, you parse your verbs on the sense of that word luo. Everybody knows the luo chart. Luo, lues, lue, luamen, lueti, luci. I can say that in my sleep because you had to learn that to be able to regurgitate at a test early on in Greek. Here you had these different tenses that are used. The word luo simply means free or loose. It's used, for instance, of a woman's hair that hangs down loose. Does that mean it was bound up on top of her head before? Or dogs that run around loose. Does that mean they were pinned up before? You have none of that, and that's the way this word is used. Now, there is a word that has reference to released. And that is something, at least one, there's actually two that are major words that I can think of, that would deal with that kind of thing where you had someone that was bound up and then the idea they're let go is the concept. Or they are uncuffed. That is the sense of what words would be used if you meant that. This word simply means as someone who is free from the bond that's there of marriage. For years, I had taken the position that, well, if this is one who's loose, I took it for granted that's what it was taking about, then they had to be loose because either there was a death of their spouse or their spouse had committed adultery. So you can't negate what Matthew 19:9 or Romans 7 would say by the use of this passage. That would be true, but I don't think that's what's being talked about now. After a little while of doing some study on this, trying to help with regard to get prepared for a debate that was coming up on divorce and remarriage, the more I studied this, the more I saw, wait a minute, that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about a woman who is a virgin, because that's what she would be called, or a man who is loose or free from marriage. That's the counterpart. One who never had been married is the point, that they are free from that. Why? Because they never had a bond of marriage, and therefore they're free from it. He says, now, if you're like that, don't seek a wife. Obviously, that's talking about someone who is male, right? Don't seek a wife. We're back in Bible culture, not in ours, so that's necessary from what we understand of what's proper. And so you have this statement that is made. Now, what happens if you allow that virgin to marry? Is there any sin involved in that? Even though Paul has already said in the present distress, it's good to remain like you are? No. That was a judgment that he made. He says it's not of the Lord. In other words, this is not a commandment. It may be wise and very wise given the particular case here, but if you marry, you have not sinned. What happens if one has departed from a wife, not for the cause of fornication, while she still lives, he takes another wife? What passage would you go to talk about that? Okay, what? 19:9. Matthew 19:9 or what else? Matthew 5:32. Either one would talk about the sense of that not being a matter that is of equal weight. There's no sin involved. Matter of fact, it's very clear. No, you have sinned. You're committing adultery in that relationship. Or if you put her away without that cause, you're also responsibility for whatever adultery she puts herself in, because you've put her in that place. So you bear culpability in that. So both of those would involve sin that's made very clearly apparent in that way. Here we're talking about something where there is no sin. Now, if you're married, you remain like that. If you're free, in other words, you don't have a marriage bond, then you remain like that. But if you marry, it's not something that's sinful. The coming distress, however, verses 29 through 31, are going to make it like what? They're going to make the advantages of marriage pass away. What advantages has he already stated of marriage and what's stated elsewhere? It's good that a man not be alone, right? Not only so in the sense of the sexual bond that's allowed there, but in what other sense? Do what? All right, the companionship. Do men and women think differently? I'm not going to say a word. That was other people who laughed, not me. Yes, we obviously understand that. When we're married and we have the one who is the corresponding, the other half of that whole, then we see that other side of it. You ever seen somebody who's an old maid or an old bachelor? They've lived all their life by themselves. They're pretty focused in their way, but they don't really have a clue about the other side of things and the way to look at that. Reason being, they've never had that experience of seeing the other half of things. Now, how could that not only be something where the companionship, the sexual desires be met properly in marriage, but that other viewpoint not be present to make a whole out of us in a time of present distress, in time of severe persecution? Likely what?
Sounds like it'd be a bad time to be pregnant.
Okay. All right. Bad time for there to be a childbearing period, just like Jesus had talked about during the attack on Jerusalem. That would be a bad time to be with child and to have to flee in that case. Go ahead.
Like as a man with a family, you have a very, or should have a very deep desire to protect them and to keep them safe, and there might be pressure.
Okay.
You know, if you're being persecuted for your belief, your family's going to be persecuted for their belief, there might be that extra pressure to recant
Yeah.
or to hide that belief. Whether
Yeah.
you know, if it's just yourself, might not be as powerful.
Do you believe Jesus is the Christ, the resurrected Lord? I might be ready to say yes. Absolutely. He pulls a knife out to my neck and said, "Are you sure you don't want to change your mind?" Well, no, I don't. Now, what if he puts it against my wife's neck? There's a bigger pressure in that sort of way. And that's the idea that he's pointing out. There is that way to use that spouse as a tool in that sense. Also, when you have persecution taking place, the tendency is that they take some off. There is that lack of presence with the spouse. And so those conjugal rights, the other things that have to do with the help that a wife or a husband might be during that time are not present because we're not together. There isn't that time spent in that way. Various things you can think of that would make this as something to where in a time of distress it's likely that those advantages of marriage are not going to be present at all times. Now, if you remain unmarried, what does that allow? That allows a serving of the Lord without distraction. It allows one to be totally devoted to Him. If you care, if you're single, if you're unmarried, Paul points out, then you care for the Lord. If you're married, you care for what? The things of your wife. Is that a criticism? No. The one who's married cares for the Lord as well. But he's got an added concern that's out there rightfully. That's a responsibility. That wife is something above himself for that man to think about. And that his care and concern for her ought to be above what he has for himself. So there's going to be that kind of an added sense. If it's necessary, he says, let the single marry. Let the ones who are unmarried or without a bond have that bond in marriage. Why? We're going through this for about the third time here. What is the point? Why may it be necessary?
Well, it's not a sin to marry.
Okay.
And by marrying, it keeps you from burning.
Okay. Back in the earlier part, it's better to marry than to burn with that passion that's there. To avoid fornication, let each man have his own wife. Let each woman have her own husband. If that continence or that sense of self-control is not present in that way, then it's better to marry than to be lost by a lack of that. The choice then is not between a good and a bad. The choice is between a good and a better under the present circumstances. And that's what the point is that's being made in verses 37 and 38. There he says, nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then, he who gives her in marriage does what? Well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. All right, there's no sin involved either way. And under the present distress, the one that leaves her without a husband in a state of being unbound or without marriage bond does better in this particular case. Again, I'm going to go back to the same point as we made the beginning of last week. Is that the norm? According to Genesis 1 and 2, is that the norm? That it's better for a man and a woman not to be married? What's the better state under the norm? That they not be alone, that they marry. And that's so under the normal term. Here, obviously, when you've got something so clearly stated, the opposite of what is the case given in Genesis, you have to look and see why. The why is because of the present distress. Now, let's notice verses 39 and 40. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the Spirit of God. Just a real quick comment in verse 40, the last phrase, I think I also have the Spirit of God. In the New King James, that's capital S. Obviously, they think it's the Holy Spirit. I don't. I think this is talking about the Spirit of God in the sense of He is looking at this with the same disposition as God is. That He's looking at this matter and seeing the present distress and what it brings. And he believes that God is behind this as well in the same kind of a frame of mind as Paul is stating here. But when he talks about those who are widows, says they are free to marry but only in the Lord. Two views of how this is typically taken among our brethren. Really three, but two main ones that I think of. Number one is the idea only in the Lord, only according to the Lord's instructions, that he marry, she marry, but not outside the instructions of what God has declared, therefore bringing all of the regulation together in this. The second one, only in the Lord, being to a Christian, marrying a Christian. Now, there's pros and cons with both views, and I'd be glad to let everybody have their own statement. To me, this comes down to what's different about this particular case. It's a present distress. Now, what would change for that case of there being persecution against Christians? What would that demand different than the norm of what's their added emphasis? I think it's that second option of this being only in the Lord, only with regard to a Christian. As far as I can see, this is talking about something, or as far as the way I look at this, it has to do with if you're going to marry, marry a Christian. If you marry a non-Christian in a time of present distress with added persecution, what's likely to happen? The two of you are going to be divided in your sense there. Not only is that not going to have any benefit for you in being married, it's going to be a detriment to you to have married in that way. When one marries, a Christian marry, and I'm always going to suggest they marry a Christian. I believe that's always wise. If they don't do that and instead marry someone who is not a child of God, is that marriage bound? Yeah. There is a marriage that's taking place. I'm going to do everything I can to get them to remain married as well in that case, even if they do what I said it's not wise to do to start with. In the case of a present distress, you have an added thing to think about. It's not just the norm of you want someone who's going to be helping you and encouraging you to stand for truth and to serve the Lord, who will give you that backbone and strength and courage. It's the fact that you want to have someone who understands what you're going through as a Christian and is going to act in harmony with what your actions are as a child of God and trying to get away from persecuting powers and various other situations. It's far better in that case of a present distress or persecutions that you're married to someone who has the same values that you do. If you don't, not only may it not be good, she may be opening the way up for added problems for you in that situation. Go ahead.
Kind of see that a little bit with Job. Whenever he's in present distress and he has a mate that doesn't have that faith in God,
Right.
What is her advice to him?
Hosea and Gomer, various cases that you see there. All right. Anything else? Go ahead.
The general phrase "in the Lord" is used other places. Is it always with the same Greek words? Is it always pertaining to under the law of Christ?
No, I don't think so. A lot of times it comes along case of Ephesians 6:4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. I believe that's a case where it is talking about Christians, not only if you're Christians. This is a case where it says only in the Lord. Ephesians 6 does not have that word only. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. In other words, children, you obey your parents. There is an added responsibility to obey your parents if you're a Christian. If you're a young person who's a Christian, you have an obligation towards Christ. Remember Colossians 2, that the one who is a Christian as a spouse has the responsibility toward her spouse as unto the Lord. A slave toward his master as unto the Lord. This kind of a sense that you are fulfilling this obligation as a part of your obligation to Christ. And therefore there's an added place there. Now, do I say that Ephesians 6:4 is a simple case that I'm sure of that? No, I see the other as a possibility too. And when I say I think that's the case, I guess I'm somewhere in the 60-40 range of that as to where I would view that as a probability. In this particular case, I'd say it's more in the 80-20 or 90-10. I think it has to do with, given the context, a situation that makes more sense for this one to talk to him. You may have been married to a non-Christian before, but if you're going to marry, you better marry one now, because with this given present distress, you're going to open yourself up to all kinds of problems if you're married to one who's not a child of God. You see what I mean? Given the present distress. Okay. But again, Jeremiah and I were talking about this. I think his probable tendency is to go more the other way, in the sense of this under the law of the Lord, or in keeping with the law of the Lord. And I understand that. I think there's perfect sense that can be made out of this. And he'll be able to have a few weeks up here with me gone. He can rebuttal me if he wants. But that is a case that can be made, and I think made well. One of those two senses is obviously there. Does it matter in a doctrinal sense which one it is? No, because we're talking about something in the first place that's what? A judgment that's to be made given a present distress. Now, whichever is the case, there's no law being bound. That would be there. If someone comes along and says, if you marry a non-Christian, then your marriage is not bound. It's not even one that's seen in the sight of God or accepted in God's sight. Whoa, now we got something that's a doctrinal problem, and we've got to deal with that. But this one, in this particular case, the doctrinal principles are the same. The question is, what is the situation under this present distress? All right, anybody else got anything there? Boy, we made it all the way through. Okay, let's look at a few things here with regard to the questions. Number 12, what judgment does Paul give to the virgins in the present distress? To do what? All right, remain as they are. 13, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loose from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Okay. 14, what is meant by the time is short? I intentionally didn't cover that one as we were going through. What does that mean? Okay, that's a parallel statement to what's the other one?
Well, everything he's talked about in this present distress.
Okay, all right. There's another way of saying the same thing. It's just another expression with regard to this time being short of what we have of this present system. It's going to be different soon, is the point. How would having a wife cause an added concern and burden to a Christian man going through a time of severe persecution? Talked about that some, but okay. What else? Anything we didn't cover?
No comment.
Anybody else? Go ahead. Larry.
Have more to worry about because you have added obligations,
Right.
and you might have to be on the move and fighting and everything.
Right. Okay. Give an example of a situation that may illustrate Paul's expressed desire under the circumstances that they might serve the Lord without distraction. An example, a situation that could illustrate that. Anybody? Well, everybody's wanting to get out there tonight.
Well, if somebody threatens my child,
Okay.
and I'm going to do something to your child, then I'm more willing to first deny the Lord,
Okay.
but just to save my child.
Okay. And same thing would go with a spouse too, wouldn't it? That love for a spouse is going to cause us to have an added avenue of temptation or trial that could be present there. Go ahead, DJ.
Or I guess if your spouse has a moment of weakness, they might be able to convince you to do the same for protection as well.
Okay.
Maybe not just a threat, but
A sway from that direction as well. Okay.
It's divided attention. I mean, your focus is now on the battle.
Right.
And you're not going to be as good in the current situation.
And that's, as we point out, Instead of without distraction, it'd be what? With distraction, a major distraction that's there. Number 17, if a Christian man is trying to decide whether to give a daughter in marriage in a time of great distress, what factors does Paul note that he must consider? This is the last one, real quick. One? Okay, her age. If she's past the flower that's there, why? Because in that particular time, as she grew older, she's going to be without anyone to care for her if she's without a marriage and without any children. What else?
Her desire.
Okay, her desire, if she has that self-control. All of these things are there. These other ones as well. But we're out of time, so I'll stop at that point. On Sunday, we will be starting with the 8th chapter of 1 Corinthians, and here are those that you can come and get. 2 pages, 1 page of text and 1 of questions.